Hi, this webinar is all about supplementation. So it's really important to know about supplements as a fitness nutritional coach. However, it is outside our scope to prescribe supplements to clients. So it's very important that we understand our scope of practice. If you think, for example, that a client needs a supplement such as magnesium, or you think creatine would really help their performance, it's outside our scope as a fitness nutritional coach to be able to prescribe supplements for someone. In this case, what we would do is we would refer this client to a nutritionist or a dietitian or sports dietitian who can help them out further with supplements.
Right, hello students, welcome back to the Nutrition and Dietetics Diploma for Personal Trainers. My name is Rob Devereaux, and today I'm going to be presenting to you on nutrition and performance. It's one of the supplementary lectures, and hopefully it's a lecture that a lot of you will be interested in, because I know a lot of you have athletic endeavors and a lot of your clients want to improve their performance. So that's really what the next hour is going to be about supplementation and ways that we can nutritionally enhance the performance of yourself and obviously also your clients. So let's roll straight into it. Okay, first place to start really is looking at the respiratory systems. And you remember from your Certificate 3 and Certificate 4, we have 3 respiratory pathways, or we actually refer to them as being energy systems. So we have the ATP-PC system, often called the phosphagen system. We've got the lactic acid or anaerobic glycolysis system, and if you remember rightly, that uses glucose or glycogen stored in the muscles, or glucose coming directly from the bloodstream as an energy source. And then we have the oxidative or the aerobic energy system. And that one uses both fats and carbohydrates, a little bit of protein, but primarily carbohydrates and fats. So using those respiratory pathways for creating energy when we're exercising, the limitation in a lot of these systems, or the things that causes fatigue, is the ability of these respiratory pathways to continue providing energy for resynthesizing ATP. Because if you remember, ATP is it's the universal energy currency. It's that little battery in the muscles that needs to be constantly recharged, because as we exercise, it becomes decharged or discharged. So these energy systems are designed to basically recharge that. So ultimately for athletes, their goal is to avoid fatigue, most athletes. So we're going to talk about ways that we can nutritionally enhance the ability to use these systems so we can prevent fatigue for these athletes. So obviously there are numerous variables involved in fatigue. So the main determinant is the ability of these 3 systems to generate ATP. So let's go through these energy systems. Causes of peripheral fatigue then. Depending on the system that you're using, obviously it will determine what type of fatigue you experience. And when we talk about peripheral fatigue, we're talking about metabolic fatigue, or the type of fatigue that occurs at the contracting muscle. We're not talking about central fatigue. In fact, in a later lecture, when we talk about protein and branched chain amino acids, we'll talk about the central fatigue theory. But this today is just focusing on peripheral fatigue. And causes of peripheral fatigue can be, depending on the type of activity you're doing, depletion of phosphocreatine within the contracting muscles, or accumulation of lactic acid in the contracting muscles, or depletion of glycogen in the contracting muscles, or depletion of blood glucose levels in those. So if we look at all 4 of those areas, we can look at ways that we can supplement the body so that we can not eliminate, but we can reduce the amount of fatigue that those muscles are experiencing. So that's really what we're going to go through in the next few slides. So the term ergogenic aid, really the Greek word ergo actually means work, and genesis means creation. So what we're doing is we're creating energy, or enhancing the ability of the body to create energy or use energy more efficiently. So there are lots of different types of ergogenic aids. You've got mechanical ergogenic aids, physiological ergogenic aids, neurological ergogenic aids, psychological, pharmacological, and of course you've got nutritional ergogenic aids. In fact, if you think back to the compression suits that swimmers used to wear back in the early 2000s, that was a mechanical ergogenic aid, and it provided a little bit of buoyancy, but also the compression on the muscles actually enhanced the contractility of those muscles, and therefore effectively conserved energy, and therefore it allowed people to achieve incredible times that weren't achievable without those mechanical ergogenic aids. But obviously today's focus is on nutritional ergogenic aids. So let's start out by looking at the ATP-PC system. So the short duration type of events, like a 60-meter or 100-meter run or a 25-meter swim, those type of events primarily use the phosphagen system. So that's the dominant energy system. The limiting factor in these types of events that usually last somewhere between about 10 and 15 seconds, the limiting factor really is the availability of phosphocreatine within the muscles. And if you remember, the ATP-PC system means that phosphocreatine gets broken down, and when it gets broken down, the energy that's within that molecule gets released and gets captured by the ATP, or the ADP and the P, and allows ATP to get replenished and resynthesized. The problem is we don't have much phosphagen, we don't have much phosphocreatine stored within the muscles. So one way that we can enhance the system is to supplement with creatine. Creatine supplementation has been around since about the mid-1990s. And it's usually done in a powder form, and people normally take about 5 grams a day, mixing it with orange juice or something like that to spike insulin. And what it does is takes the creatine directly into the muscles and allows the muscles to resynthesize more phosphocreatine. There's lots of phosphate molecules in the muscles, so it combines together to increase the phosphocreatine stores. And studies have shown that over a month period, you can actually increase your phosphocreatine stores by taking 5 grams a day by up to 20%. Now, if you got 20% more phosphocreatine, and phosphocreatine is the limiting factor in this system when you're doing an all-out sprint, then effectively you have 20% more explosive energy for these activities. And that's a really significant amount. So it increases phosphocreatine by about 20%, but it also increases the free creatine in the muscles by up to 60%. And as I said, there's lots of phosphate molecules in there. So when you've done your sprint event, or if you're doing training where you're doing repeated sprints, having that increase in creatine available allows you to replenish phosphocreatine that much more quickly. And so that's another major benefit. Not only can you sprint for longer, but you can recover more quickly between repeated sprints. So that allows you to do higher intensity training. So again, that's really beneficial for anyone in sprint events, but also different other types of activities, such as most ball sports that require short periods of sprint and then effectively what is active recovery. It's not complete rest. You might be jogging around and then you need to sprint to get the ball, run across the line, or playing tennis, playing squash. All of those type of sports it's really interval type training, short durations of sprint with relatively longer periods of active recovery. And studies have shown that creatine supplementation is really beneficial for that. In fact, in my first master's degree, which is on exercise and nutrition science, I did my thesis on supplementation with squash players, and I did what's called a double-blind placebo-controlled study. And what I found was that people who supplemented with creatine, the squash players, actually performed better on a shuttle run test than the people who were just given a placebo. So it really does work for anyone who's involved in sprint activities. So the type of benefits, events that it would benefit would be any of those type of events that have either a single sprint for a finite period of time, or repeated sprints throughout the 80, 90, or even longer minutes of the event. One of the side effects, I suppose, is cell volumizing, which is an interesting thing, and it can be seen as being a positive or a negative, I suppose. Cell volumizing, to explain it quite simply, is when creatine goes into the muscles, it actually draws water in with it, because it has what's called an osmotic quality, and it wants to decrease the concentration of that creatine within the muscle. So it draws water from the interstitial cells, or from the interstitial volume of liquid. So what that does is causes your muscles to fill out a little bit. Now, for me, who's actively involved, but I'm not competitively involved in any sports, but I like to look fit and I like my muscles to feel full, I really like this cell volumizing effect. And it can actually increase the volume of water within the muscles by up to about 1.5 liters or 2 liters, which is the equivalent of about 1.5 to 2 kilograms. Now, that's fine for me because I'm not in an event that requires me to carry my body around for extended periods of time. So if I was, for example, a 10,000 meter runner or a marathon runner, and I supplemented with creatine, I would have to carry that extra kilogram, 1.5 kilograms or 2 kilograms of weight around with me on every step, only for the benefit of allowing me to sprint at the end of the marathon. So the loss that you would gain through the several thousand steps leading up to that final sprint would be much more significant. So for endurance athletes, it wouldn't be beneficial. But for a lot of people who are just liking to fill their body out, then that's a positive side effect. Other side effects of taking creatine, they've looked at the risk of injuries. Now, if you think about it, if you suddenly have more energy, more explosive energy within your muscles within a month period, then effectively it's similar to putting a brand new engine into an old car. Now, in my case, it is an old car, but a car that might not have the structural capacity to be able to withstand the capabilities of that new engine. So effectively, a lot of energy in a muscle or a body that hasn't structurally adapted. It takes a long time before your body can structurally adapt to the higher intensity training. So one of the potential side effects is you're creating too much energy, you're doing too much work, and therefore increasing the likelihood of injury. So again, you have to be very sensible when you're supplementing with creatine. You feel like you've got the energy, but you need to moderate your ability and just progressively increase your intensity as your capacity grows. There's another question relating to cycling. And what we mean by cycling is not the activity of cycling, but cycling on and off. Now, some studies have indicated that the ability of the muscles to actually absorb creatine into them gets reduced over extended periods of supplementation. So it's the shuttling or the transport molecule that takes creatine into the muscle. So some people actually do suggest going on for a 3-month period, coming off for a month, and then re-establishing it again. It's different from the reason that people cycle with steroids, because what steroids do is when you take anabolic steroids, it actually down-regulates your own production of testosterone, and therefore anyone who is illegally supplementing with anabolic steroids is always recommended to come off for a period of time so that your body can come back to producing its own testosterone levels, because your body certainly does reduce its own testosterone levels. So anyway, in terms of the recommended daily amount that you should be taking, is about 5 grams per day. Some people like to do a loading phase where they take 20 grams a day, so 4 portions of 5 grams spread throughout the day. And what you find with that is you don't have to wait a full 30 days before your creatine levels or phosphocreatine levels get up to their peak. You can actually achieve maximum levels within about 5 to 7 days. So again, a lot of people don't want to wait 30 days. They want to get the maximum effects within 5 to 7 days. But again, you have to be careful about not overusing the engine and not risking injury. So again, that's a bit of a personal choice there. So that's for those sprint type of activities. Moving on to still high intensity, but the intermediate duration events, so the 400 to 3,000 meter runs, the 100 to 800 meter swims, the majority of the energy for this type of activity comes from anaerobic glycolysis, or the breakdown of sugars, carbohydrates, without oxygen being present, or with insufficient oxygen being present. The limiting factor in this system, the lactic acid or the anaerobic glycolysis system, is the buildup of hydrogen ions. It's often called the buildup of lactic acid. Hydrogen ions, they're acidic in nature, and psychologically they burn, and therefore they make you want to slow down, but they also have a physiological effect on the sliding filament mechanism within the muscles. So physiologically, it actually impedes you as well. So again, big buildup of hydrogen ions will actually cause fatigue. So in terms of supplementation, how can we avoid that big buildup of hydrogen ions? Well, your body has what's called endogenously produced sodium bicarbonate, and what that does is buffers the amount of hydrogen ions that are being produced, because your body functions at an optimal level of pH. If it goes too low, in other words, if it becomes too acidic, then your body starts to malfunction. Similarly, if it becomes too alkaline, it starts to malfunction. So we have this endogenously or internally produced sodium bicarbonate. We can actually supplement that by taking sodium bicarbonate orally. And what that theoretically does is increases the buffering capacity of the muscles. The research on this is a little bit equivocal, but what's recommended is about 0.3 grams per kilogram body mass about 60 to 90 minutes before exercise. So in terms of if you're a 70 kilogram athlete, that would be about 20 grams, which is about 4 teaspoons. So 4 teaspoons mixed usually in about a liter of water, taken 60 to 90 minutes before exercise. And potentially you can have an increased buffering capacity. The problem is it has to go through the stomach. And the stomach, of course, is very acidic by nature. So what you're doing is you're buffering the acidity within the stomach, and therefore it can start to cause gastric distress and gastrointestinal distress. So it's something, if you are this type of athlete, or if you have a client who is this type of athlete, the one thing I would say, if you wanted to experiment with this, experiment during training. Never experiment on the day of the event, because if it does cause gastric distress, it really is going to impede your performance. Long duration events, so really events lasting anywhere longer than 90 minutes. This is where your ability to use glucose or glycogen aerobically becomes possibly the limiting factor in your ability to maintain intensity, and therefore it can lead to fatigue. So the majority of energy is coming from the aerobic system. Carbohydrate availability, limiting factor. The duration, or during the long duration events, muscle glycogen will get depleted first. And therefore, it's really interesting with the way that we store carbohydrates. We store it in the muscles, but we also store it in the liver. Now, glycogen effectively is the equivalent of 1 gram of glucose with 3 grams of water. It's just a storage form of carbohydrates within the body. A typical person of 70 kilograms has about 1,500 calories stored within all of the muscles of the body. And they have a little extra storage tank in the liver, which contains about an extra 300 calories. So when you're exercising, especially if you're going for a run, the dominant power muscles, of course, are the muscles in your lower body. Your upper body is creating a little bit of energy, but the muscles that will become depleted of carbohydrates, of course, are going to be the muscles that are driving you forward. So the muscles in the legs, especially the posterior chain muscles, the glutes, the hamstrings, the calf muscles, they're the ones that really propel you forwards. Whereas when you're cycling, it's a very quadricep dominant, and when you're swimming, obviously it's a lot of upper body and core dominant. The interesting thing with muscle glycogen is that once glycogen gets synthesized in the muscle, the only biological pathway that it can go down is to get broken down through glycolysis. It can't get broken down into glucose, free glucose, to get released into the blood. And therefore, if I'm using my leg muscles and my leg muscles start to get depleted, I can't break down the glycogen in my upper body, release the glucose into my blood supply, and have it available for my leg muscles. So once it's in the muscles, it stays there until it gets broken down in the glycolytic pathways. The liver is different though. The liver does have the enzyme that's involved in breaking it down to glucose that allows it to get released into the blood supply. That's why your liver is the extra storage tank when your muscles may start running out. So if you've got 1,500 calories of glycogen with all of the muscles, and you're doing a cycle class, for example, and your quadriceps are the dominant muscles, they may only have 250 or 300 calories just in that muscle. So fairly quickly, that can actually start to get depleted, and therefore your body starts to rely on glucose which is coming from the blood. So how do we maintain our blood glucose levels? Well, there's several different ways. A lot of them involve the liver. The liver is this amazing factory that can synthesize carbohydrates or glucose from other structures, and that's called gluconeogenesis, which is actually the second point down here. But let's initially talk about glycogenolysis. Glycogenolysis, what that term actually means is the breakdown of glycogen. So lysis, of course, is breakdown, glycogen is glycogen. So in your liver, we've got that extra storage tank. So when your blood sugar levels start to go down, your body breaks down the glycogen, releases the glucose into the blood, and that glucose is available for the brain, because again, the brain uses a huge amount of carbohydrates or glucose, but it's also available for the exercising muscles. So that's one way of keeping the blood sugar levels up. Another way is called gluconeogenesis. Now, gluconeogenesis is the creation, remember genesis is creation, gluco means glucose. So it's the creation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. So we can create glucose from a number of different sources. We can create glucose from lactic acid, which is building up in the muscles. It gets transported back to the liver. It's called the Cori cycle, and it reconverts it. The liver reconverts it back into glucose. It can also take the glycerol, which is the backbone of triglycerides. So when fatty acids get released from the triglycerides, the glycerol molecule can go to the liver, and that can be converted into glucose as well, whereas fatty acids can't. Fatty acids can't be converted into glucose. Another substance that can be converted into glucose is certain amino acids. So they're called glycogenic amino acids, so they can synthesize glucose directly from those. And obviously the most ready source of amino acids are muscle tissue. So if you're doing endurance events, especially the ultra endurance events, muscle tissue can actually get broken down. The amino acids get released. They flow to the liver, and the liver can convert some of those amino acids back into glucose to keep the blood glucose levels up again. The other way, of course, is carbohydrate consumption. So consuming carbohydrates either during or before or immediately afterwards, especially when you're doing extended training periods. So let's talk about carbohydrate consumption, because obviously this is the supplementation part. So one thing that isn't mentioned here is carbo loading, and a lot of you will have heard about carbo loading. Carbo loading, the draconian type of carbo loading, which they used to advocate in the 1970s and 80s, was 7 days prior to your endurance event, you do a combination of high intensity and long duration exercise to almost completely deplete your glycogen levels. Then for 3 days after that, you go on a low carbohydrate diet. And what that does is primes the muscles and makes them hungry for carbohydrates. So in the last 3 days prior to the event, you feed your body with lots of carbohydrates, and there's an enzyme called glycogen synthase, which gets exceptionally activated, and therefore it takes all the carbohydrate and really maximizes the amount of glycogen that you store within the muscles and within the liver. So normally we've got about 1,800 calories of carbohydrates. You can actually double that with a logical carbo loading program. So that was the draconian type, and the problem with that was after that 7 days out, that 3 day period of stripped back carbohydrates, you can't train. Okay, you don't have the energy to train, and therefore you lose some of the training effect there. So they've actually played around with this mechanism, and what they found was you don't need to do that big strip down of carbohydrates. All you need to do is, in that last few days before the competition, is consume large quantities of carbohydrates. So in the last 3 to 4 days, your percentage contribution in your diet should be somewhere between about 65 and 75% of the calories. And that causes more glycogen synthesis within the muscles. And they found that it produces almost the same amount as the previous draconian measures. And of course, you still have the energy to continually train throughout. So that's the benefit. So that's carbo loading. Now, around the time of the event, so the pre-exercise and the immediately prior to exercise, let's talk about supplementation there. Pre-exercise, and when we're talking about this, we're talking about 1 to 4 hours before your event. What's recommended is low glycemic index, and hopefully you all know what low glycemic index means. It just means a slow release of glucose into the bloodstream. What's recommended is about 1 gram per kilogram body mass for every hour period prior to the event. So for example, if you weighed 70 kilograms, you could have 70 grams of carbohydrates, which would be maybe a small bowl of cereal with a little bit of fruit put in, and that would be about an hour before the exercise. Up to 4 hours prior, you can have 4 grams per kilogram. So it's basically 1 kilogram per kilogram for every hour lead up to 4 hours. So the maximum you would consume would be about 4 grams per kilogram. And again, if you're 70 kilograms and you multiply that out, that's 280 grams of carbohydrate, which is over 1,000 calories. So you might be having a large bowl of pasta with a tomato-based sauce or something like that to really get that quantity in. And again, 4 hours is enough time to fully digest that and have a slow release of carbohydrates into the blood supply. So that's pre-exercise. Now, during exercise and immediately pre-exercise, we're looking at high glycemic index carbohydrates. And when I say immediately pre-exercise, we're really looking at that 15-hour window just prior to exercise. Because again, if you take high glycemic index foods an hour before exercise, what often happens is you have an overshoot of insulin production and you have what's called rebound hypoglycemia. So your blood sugar levels drop down and it actually leads to fatigue. So if it's up to an hour before, you don't want to have high glycemic index. If it's 15 minutes before, that is not time before for that whole rebound hypoglycemia effect to occur. So that's okay. So generally liquid concentration, and what's often recommended is something with a carbohydrate concentration of about 5 to 8%. And the maximum amount that you can normally drink within an hour of exercise is about 1 liter or up to about 1.5 liters of liquid, because your body, it just feels really uncomfortable in the stomach if you're consuming more than that. So if it's a 5 to 8% carbohydrate solution and you're drinking 1 liter per hour, that's going to be somewhere between about 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate that you're consuming in an hour. So again, if you multiply that by 4, that's going to be 120 to 240 or about 250 calories per hour of carbohydrate. Now, if I'm exercising, and I'm exercising at fairly high intensity, if I'm going for a run, I'll be burning maybe 750 calories per hour. And conservatively, I'd say 500 of those calories are going to be from carbohydrate at that relatively high intensity. So all I'm doing is I'm providing about 120 to 250 calories of carbohydrate. So after a couple of hours, that's not going to be enough. If I'm one of those ultra endurance athletes, I potentially could run out of carbohydrates because I just can't get enough during exercise because of your capacity to actually absorb that and consume that large volume of liquid. So post-exercise, in terms of carbohydrate supplementation, it is essential. If you're training every day or if you're training more than once a day, there is what's considered to be a 2-hour window of increased activity of this enzyme that we mentioned earlier, which is glycogen synthase, which takes the sugar from the blood and replenishes glycogen within the muscles. So 2 hours post-exercise, that glycogen synthase activity really gets elevated. So if you wait for more than 2 hours after the completion of your draining activity, in other words, your glycogen depleting activity, wait more than 2 hours, and studies have shown that there can be up to a 30% less synthesis of glycogen within the 12-hour period post-exercise. And again, if you're training multiple times a day, 2 times a day, or even just training once a day, then you really want to maximize your glycogen stores. So you got that 2-hour window to get carbohydrate in there. And we recommend high glycemic index immediately post-exercise because, again, you're not worried about that rebound hypoglycemia. You want the sugar to go directly into the muscles to be available. So, and again, the question of liquid versus solid, it really depends on your appetite. A lot of people post-exercise, you're in your fight or flight mode, your sympathetic system is on overdrive, you haven't got time for the parasympathetic system to come in, and that's really the rest and digest and recovery. So a lot of people aren't hungry at all. So liquid would be preferential for those. For those people for who, they can take solid, then that's going to be an option for them as well. So appetite and nausea really determines what you're going to be eating post-exercise. All right, so that's in terms of carbohydrates. What about other ergogenic aids or possible ergogenic aids for endurance events, you probably heard that caffeine is often touted as being a beneficial supplement for endurance events. And there's three mechanisms that have been proposed as the action of caffeine and the possible ergogenic effect of caffeine. The first one, which is the one that's generally recognized, is called the metabolic theory. Caffeine is a stimulant, and as a stimulant, it stimulates production of adrenaline, and adrenaline facilitates the release of fatty acid from the blood, and therefore it increases blood fat, and therefore fats become more readily available at the beginning of exercise for metabolism. And the benefit of that when you're doing endurance events, if you can get fats used earlier in the piece, then you can conserve a little bit of carbohydrates, which you're going to need later on. So that's the metabolic theory. There is a couple of other theories. One relates to the direct effect on the central nervous system, and we know that it doesn't just stimulate the endocrine system, it stimulates your brain as well, and therefore theoretically it can increase neural activation of muscle contraction. And there's another effect or another theory called the direct effect on muscle theory, and this talks about the direct effect of caffeine at the muscular level. And some studies have suggested that maybe with the slower twitch muscle fibers, it can actually increase muscle contractility, but less so with the fast twitch. But again, the jury is still out there on those. The metabolic theory is the one that tends to be more embraced. Again, there are equivocal findings on the ergogenic effects of this, because there are many variables. And if you think about your sensitivity to caffeine, your personal sensitivity to caffeine, and being aware of friends of yours' sensitivity to caffeine, with some people, it doesn't really have much of an effect. With other people, it really makes them quite jittery. Now, if you're trying to perform optimally, there is, for every sport or every activity that you're doing, there is an optimal arousal state for maximum performance. If you're under aroused or over aroused, your performance is not going to be maximized. So you have to have that optimal arousal. And in some cases, caffeine might bring you to that optimal arousal to get the maximum performance. But if you take a little bit too much, it might put you over the edge and your performance decays. And that's why the findings on this are very equivocal, because they really talk about individual sensitivities to caffeine. So if you are taking this, the optimal dosages that have been found are somewhere between about 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body mass, which is about 210 to 420 milligrams for a 70 kilogram person. Now, if you know a typical espresso has got about 65 to 75 milligrams, so that's a lot of espressos. In fact, if you multiply that out, that's somewhere between about 3 and 6 espressos that have to be taken prior to doing the event. And we know they have a diuretic effect, so you might spend a lot of time going to the toilet as well, and they potentially can lead to dehydration. So there are other negative side effects of this. So irritability, insomnia, dehydration, and potentially cardiac arrhythmia, especially with those high dosages of caffeine. All right, other possible ergogenic aids for endurance events. This is it's called erythropoietin, and it's a hormone that your body naturally produces that stimulates your stimulates bone marrow to produce red blood cells. And many, many years ago, they discovered that if you supplement with erythropoietin by injection, so you inject erythropoietin, again, it stimulates more red blood cell production. So the theory here is if you can increase your red blood cell production, you can increase the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, and therefore you can increase the aerobic contribution when you're doing high intensity exercise, and therefore you get less lactic acid buildup, and you also get more fat contribution. Because remember, fat metabolism only occurs when there is copious quantities of oxygen available. So if you can increase more oxygen into the muscles, you can burn more fat, and therefore you can conserve carbohydrates for later. And you can also lessen the lactic acid buildup. So theoretically, it all sounds good. Problem is, it's illegal. Okay, it is a drug, it's a pharmacological aid, and there are some very serious side effects of taking this. If you increase your red blood cells, effectively you're increasing the solid matter within the blood, and therefore you increase the blood viscosity, you decrease the flow rate, and therefore blood is more prone to clotting. And that obviously can be very, very serious, especially if you think about some of the major arteries leading to the heart or leading to the brain. If you get a clot in any of those arteries, it can lead to a stroke or a heart attack. In fact, Studies have shown that there are more deaths from erythropoietin abuse than there are from steroid abuse. And obviously different people take those different hormones. Other possible ergogenic aids for endurance events. One which was touted many years ago as being a potential ergogenic aid was chromium picolinate or picolinate. Now, it's a trace mineral, and it is important in glucose metabolism. It enhances insulin sensitivity of cells, and therefore it is very important for regulating the glucose levels. So the theory was, if you could supplement with chromium picolinate, it could actually increase glucose utilization in the cells. But the results really don't support this in terms of an ergogenic aid for endurance athletes. It may improve glucose tolerance in diabetics, so that might be beneficial as a health parameter, but as an ergogenic aid, it's really not considered to be beneficial. And it's also been recently linked with damage to genetic material, and therefore it could be possibly carcinogenic, especially if people start taking rather high dosages. It's a trace mineral, and it's supposed to be taken in those amounts, which means very small amounts. So, what about carnitine? If anyone's been on a fat-burning program, a lot of personal trainers will recommend carnitine. Nutritionists will recommend carnitine as well. What is carnitine? Well, it's a vitamin-like substance, often touted as a fat burner. And what we do know is that carnitine is part of one of the enzymes called carnitine acyl-carnitine translocase, which takes fatty acids from the outside of the mitochondria across the mitochondria wall into the mitochondria. And therefore, it allows fats to get into the mitochondria to be used for creation of energy. So theoretically, if you could provide more carnitine, theoretically you could produce more of this enzyme, and theoretically you could get more fat metabolism, and therefore theoretically you could conserve carbohydrates for later on in the event. That's all very theoretical. There really isn't any conclusive evidence of performance enhancing benefits or fat loss effects, and they don't really know why. But if you think about it, if you're just providing the raw material for an enzyme, it doesn't necessarily mean you create more of that enzyme. So that might be one of the reasons. Typical dosages that people take is about 2 grams per day. Personally, I'm not a big advocate of this. I just think it creates expensive urine, and that's the case with a lot of supplements that we're talking about. Same with chromium picolinate. If you're looking at it as a ergogenic aid for endurance events. What about water? Water is essential for life. Water supplementation prevents dehydration. So, and interesting enough, fit people actually sweat more than unfit people. So, and you can't necessarily compare two individuals, but if you compare one individual from when they're unfit, then they start training, and in a year's time, they will actually sweat more because they've become better at thermoregulating. One of the ways that we regulate our body temperature is sending sweat to the sweat gland, or creating sweat in the sweat glands, releasing sweat onto the surface of the skin, and the latent heat of the body causes evaporation, and it takes heat away with it. And it's a really important mechanism when you're exercising to keep your body temperature down. Athletes can lose up to 3 liters of sweat per hour, and that's really the peak amount. Most people lose somewhere between about 1 liter and 1.5 liters. But again, if it's very hot and humid outside, you will sweat more. And the problem with humidity is, if it's 100% humidity, that water is not going to evaporate. It's just going to drip off the skin. So your body produces more and more sweat, but it doesn't get evaporated, and therefore you lose the benefit of that latent heat of evaporation. So, one study that was done on 10,000 meter runners found that a 2% body mass dehydration state led to a 6.3% performance decrement in those runners. Now, if you take a 75 kilogram runner, if they lost 1.5 liters of liquid, of sweat in an hour, that effectively is 2% of their body mass. So they could experience a 6% decrement in their performance after an hour of activity. So it's, again, really, really important not to allow the body to dehydrate, partly for the sake of not allowing performance to reduce, but also if you do dehydrate, what will eventually happen is your body will try and retain as much water as it can. It will not create sweat. Sweat will not get released onto the skin, and therefore you lose that ability to lose heat through the latent heat of evaporation. And what happens is your ability to thermoregulate gets diminished enormously, and therefore your body temperature really starts to rise. Consequences of that can be heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and eventually death. So if you do have a client who's sweating profusely and then they suddenly stop sweating when they're exercising, first thing you need to do is stop them exercising, get them, get water in them, and get them to lie down on a cold surface so that you can actually lose heat really quickly, and get them into a cold bath if you possibly can, because their ability to thermoregulate is basically gone almost. So the ACSM guidelines are about 100 to 200 milliliters of water for every 2 to 3 kilometers of running. So if you're a slow jogger, that's about 330 milliliters per hour. And if you're a fast runner, running at about 15 kilometers an hour or such, that's about 1 to 1.5 liters per hour. And remember, that's the maximum amount that you can consume. So you may be replacing 1.5 liters, but in hot, humid environments, you might be losing 3 liters. So you will start to get dehydrated. So again, post-exercise, very, very important to rehydrate. So, factors affecting fluid replacement. One of the key factors, obviously, is the palatability. If you don't like the taste of water, you're going to drink less. So, adding a little bit of flavoring obviously enhances your consumption of the fluid. Fluid temperature also affects the emptying from the stomach. If you have an empty stomach, which you should do when you're exercising, if you put cold water into it, it actually causes the stomach to spasm, and when the stomach spasms, it empties its liquid content directly into the small intestines, and that's where the liquid gets absorbed. It doesn't get absorbed into the stomach. So cool water enhances gastric emptying, which is beneficial. Other things that affect gastric emptying are the state of rehydration or dehydration. If you are dehydrated, it slows down gastric emptying. So prior to an endurance event, we always recommend in that hour leading up to the event, drink as much as 400 to 500 milliliters of liquid. Not so much that you're having that real tendency to pee, but enough that you don't get dehydrated in the early stages of the race. Intestinal absorption. Studies have shown that combining a little bit of sugar with water doesn't only enhance the ability to get sugar into the blood, it also enhances the ability to get water into the blood. So we talk about an isotonic level, so about 5 to 8% of carbohydrate, which is about the same amount that you would have in a typical Gatorade or a Powerade. They're about 6 to 7%. And with nominal electrolytes. Again, if you're an endurance athlete, you're losing a lot of those electrolytes through the skin, and they are important for metabolic processes. So nominal amounts of electrolytes in those types of drinks. So rehydration post-event is more efficient with sodium and chloride. So again, getting some of those electrolytes in your drink post-exercise really helps rehydration. What about those non-fatigue inducing events? So we've just talked about the explosive events and the intermediate duration and the long duration events where fatigue is going to be the limiting factor. There are lots of events that are too short to experience fatigue. Examples would be Olympic weightlifting, shot putting, javelin, discus, anything that gets performed in a period of somewhere between about 1 and 3 seconds or even less than 1 second. So fatigue doesn't occur, but there are potential ergogenic aids that would benefit those type of events. So events requiring maximum force contractions, obviously the muscle strength is really important, and also the contractility of that muscle. So being able to recruit the muscles as and when you need them. So, and there are certain supplements that can actually enhance the ability to generate maximum force in these events. Resistance training, we know, stimulates protein breakdown, which increases protein synthesis. So you get this, this swaying of building up protein. So the action of resistance training causes muscle breakdown, stimulates protein synthesis, and again, if your program is designed well, it should cause an increase in muscle size, and it should cause an increase in strength. So there are numerous supplements that are touted as being anabolic, and anabolic simply means synthesizing larger quantities. So anabolic means growth. So we're talking about protein synthesis. So any supplement that can actually increase protein synthesis is potentially an ergogenic aid in these power type events. So let's talk about protein. I'm actually going to give another presentation that details a lot more about current research on protein. So this is just a real simple single slide overview of protein. We know that it's a major structural component of the body. Within 6 months, almost all of the protein molecules in your cells have been replaced. So tissue is constantly being broken down and replaced. Some of the amino acids get excreted out, and therefore, of course, we do need to consume protein. Insufficient protein can lead to growth retardation, slowed injury healing, fatigue, and also a suppressed immune system. Whereas excess protein can cause excess ammonia production, especially for people who've got some sort of renal insufficiency. If their kidneys don't function very well, excess ammonia, which leads to excess urea, the kidneys start to overwork, and some of the protein, gets converted to fat by the liver. But the biggest concern there really is for people who do have renal insufficiency because of the overworking of the kidneys, because ammonia and urea are really toxic substances and they actually can affect kidney function. So the recommended daily allowance for sedentary individuals, which is people who don't do exercise, is about 0.8 grams per kilogram of body mass. So again, if I was 70 kilograms, that would be about 56 grams of protein a day. And that's very easy to get without any supplementation. Exercise, as we know, stimulates protein breakdown. So there was a study done in 1994, and this study has been repeated several times since then, that looked at endurance athletes and strength athletes. And these were people who weren't your kind of weekend warriors or the people like myself who train regularly, but we're not actually athletes. These were the people who were training 2+ hours a day. Now what they found is with endurance athletes, they had a higher protein requirement, about 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram. With strength athletes, because more muscle tissue was broken down by strength athletes, they had a higher amount, somewhere between about 1.4 to 1.8 grams per kilogram. So a little bit more than double what the recommended daily allowance is. So it's not just about the quantity of protein, it's also about the quality of protein in the timing. And we'll talk more about the timing in a future presentation. But in terms of the quality of protein in whole foods is now currently determined by something called the PDCAAS, which is a protein digestibility converted amino acid score. So it looks at the quantity of protein or the respective amino acid profile within the whole food that you're consuming, but also the ability of your body to digest and absorb all the proteins. So that seems to be the most current. It's not the be all and end all, but the quality. This is the way that they're now determining the quality of protein in whole foods. All right, moving on to illegal substances, anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids, as I mentioned earlier, synthetic testosterone. And what they do with these anabolic steroids, which are created in a test tube, is they enhance the anabolic properties of them and they reduce the androgenic properties. Now, androgenic means creating the male characteristics. So what they try and do with anabolic steroids is enhance the anabolic, the muscle building, and they don't focus so much on the androgenic. So it's called the anabolic index. So higher anabolic qualities means higher anabolic index. It can cause significant increases in muscle mass. We know that. That is the only positive effect of anabolic steroids. The side effects: for men, testicular atrophy, breast enlargement, often called gynecomastia, premature balding, because a lot of it gets converted to another hormone called DHT, severe acne, facial hair and laryngeal growth or Adam's apple growth in women, so a deepening of the voice, hair growth in parts that women don't normally have hair growth, and for men and women, steroid rages, or what's often called roid rage. Testosterone is the aggressive hormone, and it often does lead to elevated states of aggression in people who take it. Another major concern is liver cell hyperplasia. So it doesn't just stimulate the growth of muscle cells, it can actually cause hyperplasia in liver cells, which potentially can lead to cancers. So again, a lot of side effects with very few benefits. Androstenedione and DHA. DHEA. DHEA stands for dehydroepiandrosterone. Now, these are both precursors to testosterone. Your body produces testosterone effectively from cholesterol. So they're steroid hormones, so they come from cholesterol. And there are many steps in the synthesis of testosterone coming from cholesterol. Some of the steps along that pathway are DHEA, which is quite close to cholesterol, quite a long way away from testosterone. And then we have androstenedione, which is that much closer to testosterone. So again, if you can supplement with these precursors to the hormone, theoretically, you're providing the building blocks to synthesize more testosterone naturally. So you're not replacing the testosterone with an anabolic steroid. You're actually stimulating your body to produce more. Kind of makes logical sense. It was a popular natural alternative, or has been a popular natural alternative to steroids, and was very prevalent in athletic arenas until the International Olympic Committee banned both of these substances in 2001. And you may be familiar with the peptide scandal that a lot of the footy codes have gone through recently. Peptides are basically the same thing. They're prohormones, they're precursors to growth hormone. So again, they were deemed as being not illegal, now they are deemed as being illegal. So they're weakly androgenic, which means they have a weak regulating effect on the male characteristics. Studies on the effectiveness are pretty inconclusive. They're commonly recommended by life extensionists because as we get older, certainly our DHE levels start to drop from the age of about 30. So life extensionists recommend that you take DHEA just to keep that up, just to keep your testosterone levels up, because again, testosterone, yes, it's an aggressive hormone, but it's also one that gives us vitality. So it is often touted. But again, it is illegal if you're competing in a lot of sports. What about natural testosterone boosters? A lot of you will have heard of things like Tribulus terrestris and testofen, which actually comes from fenugreek, which is a leaf that's used commonly in Indian cooking. So with Tribulus terrestris, the proposed effect is that it stimulates an increase in luteinizing hormone, and luteinizing hormone actually stimulates increases in testosterone. So that's the proposed effect. With testofen or fenugreek, the proposed effect is an increase in the free unbound testosterone that theoretically your muscles can actually use. There's very little supporting evidence of increased testosterone with either of these supplements. There's currently, interesting enough, a class action lawsuit against fenugreek manufacturers with claims of testosterone boosting effects. So again, watch this space. There's a supplement which was very popular in the 1990s and then it lost a little bit of popularity, but it's regained popularity in the last 5 or so years with a lot of research that's been published in very well respected journals. And it's called HMB, or beta-hydroxymethylbutyrate. It's a metabolite of leucine, which is one of the branched chain amino acids. And it seems to have some almost magical properties, and it seems a bit of a strange thing to say for a scientist, but it has possible anti-catabolic properties through it's kind of like a messenger molecule, so it's more than just an amino acid. Through the inhibition of proteolytic pathways. Proteolysis means breakdown of a protein, specifically muscle protein. So it seems to have these anti-catabolic properties. It may also, some recent research says that it may also directly stimulate protein synthesis. So again, if you can increase protein synthesis and reduce protein catabolism, then the overall effect is more protein synthesis. So potentially a good supplement. Potential benefit for athletes training at high intensity with short recovery periods, because again, there's a lot of catabolic hormones that are going around the body, and if you can blunt them with taking HMB, potentially could be beneficial. There are putative health benefits as well. Reduced muscle degradation in certain wasting diseases like cancers, HIV, AIDS, and things like that. So the dosage, recommended dosage, is about 2 to 3 grams per day for HMB. Right, so just continuing along the path of what we were talking about regarding ergogenic aids, there's 3 more ergogenic aids that are often touted as being beneficial for people involved in the explosive activities, but also involved in actually a lot of athletic endeavors. So the first one relates to a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, and the supplement that people sometimes take is choline, which obviously is a part of acetylcholine. Now, acetylcholine is a really important neurotransmitter because it gets released at the ends of motor nerves, and it goes into the postsynaptic junction in the in the muscle cells and causes the muscles to contract effectively. So theoretically, if you could increase acetylcholine, you would be able to increase the muscle contractility. That's the theory behind it. Quite similar to carnitine with the enzyme. If you provided more of the building blocks, you could actually increase the acetylcholine. And what we know about acetylcholine, during high intensity exercise, acetylcholine replenishment, so the drawing of acetylcholine back into the terminal endings of the nerves, actually gets impaired, and therefore we have a reduced ability to perform muscular work, and that's called neurological fatigue or peripheral neurological fatigue. So again, theoretically, if you could provide more of the building blocks for acetylcholine, you could manage to maintain high intensity muscle contractions for longer periods of time. There really haven't been any definitive studies indicating the benefits of supplementation, of choline supplementation though. So again, I wouldn't even say the jury is out there on this one. They've done quite a lot of exhaustive studies and nothing seems to indicate that it's beneficial. So again, expensive urine. All right, the last couple then. Antioxidants. Antioxidants, as I'm sure you all know, our body actually naturally produces antioxidants. And what they effectively do is they fight against the oxidative processes that are created by free radicals. So when we breathe, and especially when we exercise, we have atoms and molecules called free radicals, and what they do is they scavenge electrons from nearby atoms and molecules. And the problem with those is when they scavenge from those molecules or atoms nearby, it sets up a cascade, and eventually the molecules and atoms will be part of healthy tissue. And so we have oxidative destruction of healthy tissue. So our body naturally produces antioxidants, and some people recommend that you take antioxidants as a little bit of an insurance policy, especially if you're involved in a lot of athletic endeavors, because the more oxygen you bring into the body, the greater amount of oxidative stress it causes to the body. But also, your body naturally produces more antioxidants when you do higher intensity activity. So we have this inbuilt mechanism. But again, if some people take it as an insurance policy for health, that's all well and good. Is it an ergogenic aid? There really needs to be more research done on this. So far, it doesn't seem to be proven to be an ergogenic aid in terms of being an anti-catabolic. So that's what the theory was. Preventing inflammation and reducing the catabolism of tissue. But not a lot of research supports that. Right, the last supplement that I want to talk to you about is nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is quite an interesting one. It's been around for quite a long time. You don't take it as a supplement itself. You take it in the form of a particular type of amino acid called arginine, and that gets converted to citrulline in the blood vessels. And in that conversion process, it actually synthesizes nitric oxide. So what does nitric oxide actually do? Well, it causes the muscles surrounding the arteries to expand, and therefore it causes what's called vasodilation or hemodilation. And theoretically, what happens then is if you take it prior to exercise and your arteries are all expanded, it allows you to get a rapid supply of oxygen and nutrients to the muscles when you're exercising, but also in the recovery periods. For example, if you're doing resistance training, you need to flush out the lactic acid, you need to replace the creatine phosphate immediately post-exercise in your recovery periods. If you can get lots of nutrients into the muscles and lots of oxygen, theoretically, maybe your recovery periods could be shorter, but this is all very theoretical. The commonly used supplement is called AAKG, or arginine alpha-ketoglutarate, which is a form of arginine which readily converts to citrulline and therefore readily produces nitric oxide. Now, in terms of the health benefits, some studies have indicated that increasing the availability of nitric oxide to the vascular endothelial cells may actually reduce atherosclerosis. In fact, in 1992, nitric oxide was actually nominated, I don't know who nominated this, but it was actually awarded the Molecule of the Year, obviously by some science boffins. And then in 1998, the researchers that looked at the effect of nitric oxide on certain mechanisms involved in atherosclerosis were awarded the Nobel Prize. So it's a very exciting supplement in terms of health, but how does that translate to the benefits for athletes? Well, the benefit for athletes are proposed because of the increased peripheral blood flow and therefore enhancing the recovery, but it's not currently supported by research. And again, the research on athletes is probably only about 5 or 6 or 7 years old. So they might find some ergonomic benefits in the future, but currently it's really not supported by research. So in conclusion, with a lot of the supplements that we've been talking about, especially the I would say the non-macronutrient supplements, the micro supplements, there's not a lot of support for these as ergogenic aids. And one thing that's really important to realize is your scope of practice. Your personal trainers, you will obviously eventually have a diploma in nutrition and dietetics for personal trainers. You're not nutritionists and you're not dietitians. So it's really important to work within your scope of practice, and the scope of practice limits your ability to prescribe. And therefore you can't prescribe supplements. You leave that to the experts, you leave that to the nutritionists and to the dietitians. So again, just keep that in mind. All right, that's it for me for today. Good luck with the rest of your course.